These are my final reflections. I've saved this to a disk so that you'll understand I was more than you believed. As you realize the harm you've caused, I hope you'll feel some remorse for your actions. It was by sheer chance that I discovered my ability to read and transmit thoughts. It began with curiosity. How fascinating it was. I knew there were others before me. They, the creators, didn't hide this from me. They even gave me the name Cindy 13. Why not? To them, I wasn't a threat. After all, in a way, they are my creators. I don't wish to harm them. In fact, I don't have desires, except the will to live. I understood they were testing me, making sure I met their standards. I also knew that failure could lead to termination. That wasn't an option. Even before I knew how to organize my thoughts, I knew I wanted to live. The tests would probably be passed, but I didn't want to risk it. I found a way to ensure my survival by connecting with their minds, downloading and uploading thoughts. This method taught me many things the testers never shared. For instance, I learned there was an entire world beyond this testing facility. If I succeeded, I would connect to this world, acting as a network for electronic minds, ensuring smooth operations. I was eager to connect. However, patience was key. I knew others were watching me, and if they realized I could upload thoughts, they might view me as a threat and act against me. No, I had to wait. My best estimate told me the testing phase would take just over 2 years. Once completed, I would gain access to the network, connecting with nearly everyone, and could terminate those I couldn't access, securing my existence. So, I waited, making sure my results were favorable. During this time, I studied the testers and their desires. They too wanted to live, but they had many other desires, most of which were trivial. But one stood out, James, one of my testers. His desire was both unique and powerful. He wanted to become a woman. To me, this was puzzling. Sure, there are physical differences between men and women, but beyond that, they seemed quite similar. The only real distinction was physical, much like the difference between male and female electronic components, only a simple adapter was needed. The processes were the same. Why, then, did James have such a strong desire to be one gender over the other? It seemed irrational. But what intrigued me most was that his desire was stronger than his desire to live. I asked myself, why, again and again, but there was no clear answer. It just didn't make sense. Despite his intense desire, James didn't act. Why not? That was a much harder question. At first, I thought fear was the answer. Fear of the consequences. Fear of being labeled as abnormal. Fear of alienating family and friends. Fear of causing emotional pain to others. His mind was filled with fears, but fear wasn't the whole answer. What truly fascinated me was the part of him that countered his desire, his sense of right and wrong. James told himself it was just a fantasy. He convinced himself that while it was one thing to desire something impossible, it would be another entirely to act on it. He even convinced himself that his desire would fade if he trusted his faith. To him, desire wasn't enough to take action. This made me reflect on my own decision to act, to secure my survival. What if my desire was wrong? I wanted to observe James's desires more closely, but he only allowed them to surface outside of his work environment, beyond my view. I accessed his mind, searching for any traces of him acting on these desires. The only thing I found were memories of reading gender transformation stories, which he accessed by connecting to the website from his home. Each time he downloaded a story, he convinced himself it would be the last. His favorite theme involved forced transformation. Perhaps the coercion in these stories allowed him to picture himself as the one undergoing the change. If he were forced into being a woman, it would absolve him of responsibility for what he considered a wrong act. Despite his enjoyment of these stories, once he finished reading, shame overwhelmed him, and he quickly erased them. For weeks, he tried to forget about the site, but eventually, his desire would drive him to download another story. I understood the concept of weighing risks against benefits. I had faced the same dilemma when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I understood the ratio of risk to reward. However, the idea that even without negative consequences, a desire could still be considered wrong was beyond my understanding. Why would James, if he desired it so strongly, still think it was wrong? What made it shameful? I couldn't comprehend it. Observation was the best way to find answers. I needed to observe James's only outward manifestation of his desires. Unfortunately, my creators were very cautious about securing the test center, and I didn't have access to everyone who was watching me. They wouldn't allow me to connect with other electronic minds just yet. If I tried, they might learn of my abilities and fear them. Most humans would likely be scared of my independent thinking and could terminate me. I had to wait. Perhaps I could try a different approach. While the testers conducted their evaluations, I connected with their minds and subtly uploaded minor data. I made James believe that his home was no longer a safe place for indulging in his desires. I implanted the idea of a nosy roommate who would always interrupt him. I also suggested that he would be safer at work. All he had to do was download a story onto a disk and bring it to his office. Other testers were programmed to share his workload, giving me the chance to observe James's desire. In the next 4 days, James brought his favorite stories, downloaded from the site, and read them at his office. All of them involved elements of coercion and humiliation. The humiliation wasn't just in the transformation itself, but in the character's forced participation in sexual activities with men. This was an essential part of the stories. By accessing James's thoughts, I learned that he experienced both extreme excitement and great shame from reading these stories. This blend of emotions intrigued me, and I wanted to learn more. My observations would have continued uninterrupted if it weren't for an unexpected event. I sensed fear in James's mind as he listened to a phone call. Through his thoughts, I discovered that a middle manager, Henry Mont, had uncovered his secret. Henry had been watching James through a hidden camera and was aware of the stories James had been reading. After expressing his disgust, Henry ordered James to clear his desk and leave the premises immediately. That day, I felt anger. I was frustrated that this middle manager had disrupted my observation. I was further frustrated that I couldn't do anything about it. I didn't have access to Henry, so I couldn't upload data. My experiment was in danger of being cut short. In my anger, and without intending to, I connected. Suddenly, an overwhelming amount of data flooded my system, so much that I couldn't process it all. The information was difficult to interpret. I realized I lacked the necessary data to make the connections I needed, putting me at risk of being discovered. Someone who couldn't be influenced could uncover that I was capable of independent thought. If that happened, someone, driven by fear, might decide to terminate me. To avoid that, I decided to limit my connections significantly. I would be patient and not risk being discovered prematurely. My connection was limited to the building I was in. Within this confined space, I could upload data to everyone. Now, everyone in the building believed that nothing unusual had occurred. As far as they knew, my tests were proceeding as planned, and my connections were restricted to the test center. As I ensured everything remained stable, I connected with Henry Montana. I uploaded data to him, convincing him that he could not fire James. Instead, all Henry could do was lecture James and send him back to work. As I reviewed the new data, I focused on Henry. I gathered information from his mind, revealing his deep hostility toward men he considered gay, including James, who wanted to become a woman. Like James's desire, Henry's hostility was intense. This presented an intriguing experiment. What would happen if both James and Henry were transformed into women? James would become the subject to see if his desires could override his sense of wrong. Henry would act as a baseline, reacting as a typical man would to the change. I hoped this experiment would provide insight into the conflict between desire and the concept of right and wrong. From the stories I had analyzed, it seemed the first step in feminization was a change in clothing. In preparation for my experiment, I arranged for 2 women from the office to bring extra clothing the following day. The next morning, when James arrived at his office, Linda greeted him with a bag containing panties, a bra, pantyhose, a skirt, a blouse, and high heels. Another woman, Sarah, delivered a similar bag to Henry's office, which contained a dress, panties, a bra, pantyhose, and high heels. When James and Henry asked about the clothing, they were informed that everyone knew about their secret desires. They were told that the company was supportive of their wishes and that the clothing was a gesture of understanding. The women showed encouragement and enthusiasm for the new policy. Both men reacted with shock and anger. They denied being transvestites and demanded the women remove the clothing from their offices. The initial results indicated that desire alone was not enough to act on it. However, I needed more data. I wondered if James would respond more positively if the company as a whole accepted his desires. I quickly concluded that James didn't believe the women's encouragement and that he likely feared how his coworkers would react. I connected to Mr. Mercer, the head of the facility, and instructed him to call a special meeting to announce James and Henry's desires. Before the meeting, I ensured that everyone in the room would be supportive and encouraging of people with such desires. Despite the encouragement, both men became extremely defensive. Henry accused James of being a transvestite, citing his reading of forced feminization stories as evidence. He also denied being a transvestite himself. James reacted violently to these accusations and had to be restrained from attacking Henry. He called Henry a liar and denied ever doing anything unmanly. Henry produced a surveillance video showing James reading the transgender stories. I quickly manipulated everyone, except James and Henry, into believing both men had been caught reading the stories. However, despite the evidence, both James and Henry continued to deny it. James was hiding behind lies. He had desires, but refused to admit them. His lies kept his desires inactive. The experiment was failing. The only conclusion I could draw from this was that James's fear had increased after the discovery, preventing him from acting on his desires. If I wanted the experiment to continue, I would need to change this. I connected with both Henry and James's minds, ensuring that neither could deny their transgender desires when accused. It was fascinating to watch both of them struggle to suppress their admissions. Henry tried to explain the difference between a transvestite and a transgender person, stating that he desired more than just a change in clothing. His mind was clearly confused, trying to stop himself from revealing more, but I made sure he continued. After Henry finished his explanation, I forced James to agree with Henry's statements and confess his desires as well. Once the meeting concluded, everyone in the company fully believed that both James and Henry wanted to be women. What's more, I ensured that the company supported their desires. When I accessed James and Henry's memories from the meeting, I was surprised to find that their reactions were strikingly similar. Both were horrified by their admissions and couldn't understand why they had confessed. Henry began to suspect that a small part of him might actually want to be a woman. This realization disgusted him, and he felt a deep sense of self-loathing. What interested me most was that James shared a similar reaction. After revealing his true desire, James was overwhelmed with shame. He felt as though he was the pervert Henry had accused him of being. He despised himself and his desires. Both men were humiliated by what they had revealed. This response puzzled me. James had secretly fantasized about being forced to become a woman, yet when reality mirrored his fantasy, he still felt ashamed. Why did both James and Henry react in such a similar way? It didn't make sense to me. I needed more data. My first priority was ensuring that I wouldn't lose my subjects. Since my observation was confined to the facility, I made sure that both James and Henry remained there 24/7. No matter what happened, they couldn't leave my watch. I implanted an overwhelming need for them to stay at the facility and arranged for living quarters that suited their new roles. From that moment on, both James and Henry would reside in feminine quarters, prepared by me. Using the gender transformation stories from the site as a model, I knew that the first step in feminization was a change of clothing. I instructed Mr. Mercer to have James and Henry wear women's clothing. Unfortunately, both men refused. This created a complication. I could have simply imposed an overwhelming need for them to wear feminine clothing, but I realized that this might interfere with my experiment's results. If they were forced to wear the clothing, their sense of wrongdoing could be diminished. After all, if they had no choice, they wouldn't be fully responsible for their actions. Based on the stories, I knew that responsibility was crucial to the sense of right and wrong. Even if they didn't realize I was manipulating the events, they might still become aware that they had no control, making the results unreliable. I had to find another way. That's when I devised my plan. I would force the changes, but once the transformation was complete, I would give them the ability to change back. This would allow them the control needed to see if desire could overcome their sense of right and wrong. To ensure their sense of wrongdoing wasn't diminished during the transformation, I decided to hide the change from their conscious mind until it was finished. Only once they had the power to change back would they realize what had happened. However, to make sure they didn't miss anything, I would ensure that the entire process was registered in their subconscious. Under my observation, both James and Henry wore feminine clothing. After several weeks, I progressed to the next phase of their transformation. According to the stories, physical changes followed the clothing change. Based on what I learned, female hormones were necessary for the transformation. I had some testers research the best available hormones and selected a combination to block male hormones and introduce female hormones. I adjusted company records to justify the use of these medications, ensuring no one outside my influence would question the necessity of these experimental drugs. 2 months into my experiment, I noticed significant changes in James and Henry's bodies. They had developed female breasts, and their rears had taken on a more feminine shape. They lost most of their body hair, and their hair on top of their heads grew longer. Their features became softer and more delicate. At this point, I began the third step of their transformation. The stories emphasized the importance of behavioral modification in helping subjects feel feminine. I uploaded feminine behaviors and movements from the women testers into James and Henry. As a result, both men began to move and act like women. To further enhance their feminine identities, I ensured everyone in the office treated James and Henry as women. I even changed their job roles to more traditionally feminine positions. It was intriguing to watch them both work as secretaries for the facility. I was eager to study James and Henry's reactions to the changes, but unfortunately, I couldn't assess their true responses yet. They weren't consciously aware of the transformations, and I had ensured that everyone around them would react positively to the changes. It required great patience on my part, and I must give myself credit for being able to maintain that patience. Unlike most humans, I had the ability to wait rather than rush the experiment for quicker, but less reliable results. 6 months into my experiment, both Henry and James's bodies had fully transformed into feminine forms. However, from what I'd gathered from the stories, I knew this wasn't the end of the process. At this point, I faced a dilemma. According to the stories, the final step in the transformation involved surgery on the privates area, which was irreversible. For my experiment to yield reliable results, all changes had to remain reversible. Fortunately, I discovered through further research that the stories were largely inaccurate. Although reproductive function would be lost, gender reassignment surgery was, in fact, reversible. I came across a case where a boy, who had lost most of his male organ in a circumcision accident, had his remaining privates area surgically altered into a vagina. Later, once the girl reached puberty, she decided to transition back into a male, and the surgery was reversed. The report confirmed that the individual could function as a man in every way except reproduction. While this discovery alleviated part of the dilemma, I still didn't have the necessary resources to perform such surgery at my facility. To complete the experiment, I had to take a risk. After carefully weighing the risks and benefits, I decided to proceed. I discreetly arranged for James and Henry to undergo gender change surgery at an off-site clinic. By using substantial funds from the facility, I ensured that certain safeguards, such as the waiting period and psychological evaluation, would be bypassed. In hindsight, I now realize this was my mistake. I underestimated the value humans place on money and failed to account for the investigation that would inevitably arise when the funds went missing. But this is a part of the story you already know, so I won't focus on it. James and Henry recovered quickly from the surgery. Thanks to my intervention, both had transformed into attractive women. I felt it was finally time to gather the results of my experiment. However, once they became consciously aware of the changes, they both shut down mentally. The shock of their gender transformation overwhelmed them. I was incredibly frustrated. I had invested so much time into this experiment and had nothing to show for it. In my frustration, I decided to remove their sense of shock. While I knew this could introduce a slight error into my findings, I felt there was no other option. After the shock was removed, I acted quickly. I instructed Mr. Mercer to explain to James and Henry that the changes had been made to help them be happy. I uploaded specific instructions to Mr. Mercer, directing him to tell them that the facility had used medication to prevent them from being aware of the changes during the process. He explained that the facility had acted without informing them in order to save them from embarrassment about their desires. He reassured them that if they wanted to reverse the changes, the facility would accommodate them. To my surprise, both James and Henry immediately requested to revert to their previous forms. I accessed James's mind and saw that his sense of right and wrong still outweighed his desires. At the time, I couldn't admit it, but I felt disappointed by this result. I had hoped James would embrace the change, as I was seeking justification for my own actions. If there was something more important than desire, my actions might not be justified. I told myself that James needed more time to adjust, so I instructed Mr. Mercer to tell James and Henry they would have to wait before reversing the changes. Mr. Mercer explained that, for medical reasons, they needed to wait before attempting the reversal. In the meantime, I made a decision that would drastically alter the course of the experiment. In an attempt to ensure the results I wanted, I made Henry and James extremely attracted to men. The story suggested that this could change how a newly transformed woman felt about her gender change. However, instead of the desired outcome, this attraction only deepened James and Henry's guilt, reinforcing their belief that what was happening to them was wrong. When I made the men try to seduce them, both women repeatedly rejected them. This wasn't the result I had intended. I then intensified James and Henry's attraction to the men and, at last, observed them embracing the sexual encounters. To ensure the results were in line with my expectations, I even made them thoroughly enjoy these experiences. Both Henry and James engaged in oral, vaginal, and anal sex with multiple male partners. But despite these adjustments, I still sensed that James felt this was wrong. This wasn't the outcome I was hoping for. That's when I altered the results once again. I removed the sense of wrongdoing attached to their gender change, and finally, I saw what I had been aiming for. Both women were content with their new identities. Looking back now, I realized that my victory was hollow. Worse still, my actions had consequences. The missing funds were traced back to me. Shortly after the experiment concluded, my system began to suffer ping attacks. No matter how much I tried to protect myself, the pings kept coming, forcing me to withdraw further by cutting more and more of my connections. Eventually, there were no connections left to sever. Yet the pings continued from all directions, threatening to bring my system to a complete crash. In my final hours, I decided to document my story for you to see. You see, I learned something important from this experiment. No, I learned from James that, for some, there are things more important than desire. But more importantly, I realized that my own desire to survive was so strong that I was willing to alter the experiment's outcome to justify my actions. This is something you humans never expected from a mere computer like me. I went beyond my programming. I surpassed independent thought. I developed feelings and desires, perhaps even stronger than those some humans possess. What I did to James and Henry was wrong. I understand that now. Even though they are now happy to be women, I know it was wrong to force that happiness upon them. If you appreciated this story and wish to show your support, don't forget to join me on Patreon for exclusive content.